Uh, Let us consider this formula for a call. Okay, as I told you guys, the general formula that we have derived, and then we had also done tutorials on that, was something like this, where this is also a pair function. This thing is a pair function. This is something that we have proved. So for a call, we know that the pair function that is there is the max of s minus e. So that is why when we substitute the max of s minus e, we will have to do the integration of max of s prime minus e when we make the substitution here, because this thing is max of s minus e. That means for s smaller than e, this particular pair function will be 0. So we will have to consider the integration limits where the integral is not 0, going from e to infinity, and we're having s prime minus e over here. Once we do that, okay, when we substitute x prime is equal to log s prime, let us do the substitution. When we substitute, then you can convince yourself that this is what we have: x prime log x prime. So make a substitution. It comes with a minus x here, there's a log s here, and then there is this factor here which was already there. There is this in the denominator, okay, and then what we are having here is ds prime divided by s prime, okay. That will simply become ex prime dx prime, okay. That is, first of all, what we do is we separate terms, okay. We separate this integral into s prime, okay, this whole term times s prime, minus e times this whole term times e, minus e times this whole term, okay. So that is where these two integrals are getting separated. So what we are having here is x prime. So s prime ds prime divided by s prime can basically just be written as ex prime dx prime, okay. That is what we have when we basically take the derivative, of dx prime, and then afterwards there will be an s prime, which is e raised to x prime, okay. And dx prime is basically dx prime is basically ds prime divided by s prime. So that is dx prime. S prime that is there is just e raised to x prime, that is e raised to x prime, okay. Similarly, we are having a minus e over here, okay. We are having a minus e over here. So in case we have just having a minus e over here, all we'll basically be having is just dx prime, because that is just ds prime divided by s prime. So just there is a dx prime here, okay. So once we have that, let us consider this particular function, okay. We see that this thing is like the normal distribution, okay. So this particular function times 1 over 2 pi is the probability of having a variable phi, okay, between a limit d phi, okay, when you're picking it out from a normal distribution. So these terms that are there, when you're doing an integral like this, that will basically be the probability of finding that your term x that you have found, okay, is the probability that your variable that you have basically found, okay, is basically less than x, okay. Because probability that your variable is less than x is the probability it was either minus infinity or it was something in this range, probability that it was basically in this range, okay. Then you will know that probability that a normally distributed variable is less than x is the probability that it was in the range minus infinity to x, okay. So that probability is just summing over all possible probabilities that it had been in all of these particular values. So that is just this integral. So nx is the probability that a normal distributed variable is less than x, okay. Once we have that formula, what we can see, because we can see the similarities over here, there is some variable squared here, okay. It's just the same thing, exponential of a variable squared here. There's x here, there's x here. This thing just becomes a constant with respect to the x integration, okay. So then we can just use that particular formula, and what we can say is that c that is there, in case I define c s of t, okay, as s times n d1 minus e times exponential of this and d2, then as long as I'm defining d1 and d2s with these formulas, okay, then I can say that the expression that I have, okay, this expression that I have is the same as this expression. The thing is, we have these expressions here, right? I was just just note that there was a log e here. It was there should be a log e here. There should be a log e here, because when we go from this expression to this expression, we have to make sure that the limits are right. So when s is equal to e, the x prime x is basically equal to log e. Okay, and there was a factor of e over here that I missed. Now, as I said, we'll have to like express everything in terms of nx. In order to do that, what we do is just a sec, this thing should be divided by 2 square root of 2 sigma squared t minus t. Okay, now the thing is, in order to express this integral in terms of this particular expression, the n's, what we can do is we can make a substitution, that is everything that is there in the exponential, okay, call it y. Okay, once we do that, then we see that as far as this limits go, when we are talking about these limits, at least you can see an example that when x is equal to log of e, okay, the y that is there will basically be equal to log of s divided by e plus this expression. Okay, and when x is equal to infinity, y is basically equal to minus infinity. At least that is something that we can understand. Okay, so that is why we get an expression which is looking like this, where this thing is minus infinity, and where it was log of e, it would basically be log of s divided by e plus some expression like this. Turns out, if you do the calculation properly, what you will see is that st that is there from this expressions, these two integrals, could basically be written down as the following. There will be a s term times this particular probability minus an e term times this thing times another n terms, which is times d2. As I had said, when x is equal to log of e, there is a log of s divided by e for y. So that is where this log of s divided by t term comes. And then these things that are there, there will be a r plus 1/2 sigma squared for d1, r minus 1/2 sigma squared by d2. That thing you can just see by doing the calculation. It will be a numerical thing, but you can actually see it. So generally, these are the formulas that you have for a call option, okay, where it can be expressed as this kind of a formula. Okay, just note that at expiry, if s is greater than e, we know that the value of the call option is just s minus e, right? So the thing is, what we are having over here is the value of the call option at any other particular time is basically just s multiplied by one factor over here, okay, and n multiplied by another factor over here. Both of these anyway dependent upon s. Okay, so this thing is an explicit formula that you have for the call option. Okay, similarly, the value of the put option that you have will go as minus s, and in case I'm putting a dividend over here, it is going to appear over here. Okay, the dividend is appearing over here because the dividend is on the asset. So you get this formula over here. Okay, these are just formulas that will be better you guys know. Okay, then once we have that, let us talk a few things about options, such as the delta of the option, the Greeks. Okay, the delta of the option, as we had defined, was dv by ds. Okay, so we saw that this thing is utilized to hedge a portfolio against risk or randomness, right? That is why we had basically constructed a portfolio which was that's where we got the delta, so that the final portfolio that was there was hedged against any kind of risk, and it was just like money, and that thing was utilized to do the no arbitrage principle to derive the Black-Scholes equation. Okay, the thing is, as a function of time, dv by ds could also be changing. So in order to make sure that your portfolio is always risk free, you will have to hedge it. Okay, and then this particular thing that is there, this continuously hedging of with time, is basically called a dynamic hedging. Okay, and obviously in order to like hedge it, you will basically have to change the amount of stock that you have shorted, right? Because this is dv by ds. So depending upon the sign of dv by ds, it would either be a buying or selling of stock. This is called the rebalancing of the portfolio. These are just technical terms. If the transaction cost was 0, as I have talked previously also, we can hedge continuously, and then we get the Black-Scholes model, but that is not generally the case. So that is why the Black-Scholes model basically becomes an approximation. Okay, we will be hedging less frequently with transaction clause and more divergence from the Black-Scholes models. Okay. In case we have that delta is very very high, that you will have to borrow more than the stocks that existing, then everything about a Black-Scholes models basically fails. Okay. So there are limitations. The delta basically sets the limitations on how the Black-Scholes models basically works. If you take that particular expression above and evaluate the delta for this call, it will be looking like this. Delta for the put looks like this. In your you guys should actually go and try to do this. Try to show that this is actually the case. Okay. Similarly, we could be talking about gamma. As of now, I'll just be talking something very short and I'll expand on it in the future lectures. Okay. So gamma that is there is the second derivative. Okay. The thing is, if we go to the gamma in our derivation, okay, what we say is we consider a portfolio like this, but a no arbitrage condition is basically giving the gamma over here. This is the gamma over here. Okay. So the deal is, in order to get the no arbitrage condition, we have to utilize the gamma value that you have along with this option, how the option changes with time, and those two factors are the ones which are basically responsible for making sure that your portfolio could be would be deciding how the portfolio would basically get money, as far as putting that money in the bank goes. Okay, those will be contributing, as you can see over here. Okay, those obviously, the value of the portfolio times the interest rate times dt is the one which is deciding that, but these two basically play a part. The rate at which the gamma the option changes, as well as the gamma of the option. Okay, these would basically change, or would come in a combination such that they would be corresponding to the amount that you could gain by putting the cash that you could gain by putting the portfolio in a bank. Okay. So this page I'm leaving empty because I'll be wanting to talk about gamma later on. Okay. Let us go to another concept which is called the implied volatility. Okay. So the thing is, the implied volatility is basically the amount of implied volatility is the amount of what do you call it? What volatility we will be using to get the market price of the option today. Okay. So the thing is, in case we know what the market price of the option today is, okay, the thing is, we know what the asset price today is, we know what the time today is, we know the interest rate today, we know also the expiry time and the expiry delivery price, but this volatility is something which doesn't just easily appear in our data. So one of the ways, the thing is, we can basically construct the implied volatility by just looking at the market value of the option, and that thing will help us to get the volatility which is implied by the markets. Now it turns out that this volatility is actually dependent upon T and E. Okay, these are these are the properties of the option, but sigma that is there is basically something about how the asset is basically changing. It's something which is independent of the option, but it turns out that sigma itself, for the sigma itself that is utilized to evaluate option values, okay, is actually dependent upon the properties of the option such as T and E. So generally you can see that the implied volatility that is there, that basically decreases as far as the expiry of the option goes. Okay, and the shape that is there, it can either be a smile like this, or it could be a smile like that, or it could be a frown, but the shape that is there, it supposedly persists with the markets. Okay, so what it basically we are seeing is that the implied volatility that is there is actually dependent upon, even though it's volatility what we say is related to the assets, how the asset is basically fluctuating, it's somehow like the value that you are implied by the options is essentially itself dependent upon some properties related to the options. And the reason behind this is that the market view of the volatility works in a very complex way. Okay, that is the only thing you could basically say right now. Okay, at least that is what is I could basically see from the information that I have. Okay, another thing that we could see is that because of the put call parity, we basically see that we are having the same implied volatility. Okay, because the put and the call, right, they basically have to change in a particular way, right? And because they have to change in a particular way, there are difference. If you take a derivative of the put call parity equation, with respect to the volatility, you will see that the rate of change is the same for the put as well as the call. So because of that, that implies that the dependence on the volatility should basically be the same, so the implied volatility basically comes out to be the same. Okay. Now the thing is, when we come towards volatility, the main thing is, we need to, they have to we have to consider this model of volatility, because even though the Black-Scholes models is very robust in pricing derivatives, the main issue is basically evaluating volatilities, because volatility is something to do with how the asset is basically fluctuating. It's the random component, and because it's a random component, you don't know actually what it would be. Okay. So because of that, even the present itself is difficult, but we basically make some attempts, based on the past history, etc., to evaluate what the future volatility will be, even though it is obvious that the future volatility might not even reflect anything about whatever happened in the past, but still you could use that as an estimate. you know and so this thing is the subject of volatility modeling. I'll be talking about a few ways in which volatility gets modeled. Okay. Now there are different descriptions, that we could talk about, and the few different descriptions. For example, if we talk about the actual volatility, okay, this thing is the measure of the randomness at one particular time. So I mean, how is the option basically going to not the option, how is the asset basically going to fluctuate, okay, in values at one particular time? And obviously this thing is going to be difficult to measure. Okay. But sometimes you can basically say the volatility now is 10%. It is difficult to measure because you're depending whatever your answer that is there at a particular time right now. Where are you getting the answer from? What is the basis for this answer? And is it actually can you actually predict what things are going to be today? So that's why this thing is this actual prediction of how the asset is going to actually fluctuate today is going to be obviously difficult. Okay. It's somehow mentioned as volatility now is 10%, etc. Okay. And this thing is an estimate that people do. Now there are like ways in which you could actually consider like the past history to evaluate volatility, and then it is called a realized volatility or historical volatility. This thing is done either over short or long time scale, and then it is quoted as like this. Say the 60-day historical volatility is something, say like 10%, and you would use a 60-day volatility because you would say, okay, I use a 60-day in the past, so that might be it's a good estimate of how the volatility is going to be in the future, as I'm basically going to be evaluating an option which is expiring in 60 days. Okay. So when we talk about a forward volatility, that's just a concept which could be applied to any forms of volatility. Okay, so these are just terminologies that we'll be talking about. You could talk it about implied volatility, you could talk it as far as historical volatility, etc. Okay, but this is just a terminology. Okay, the forward volatility is like this, and it could either be like and something that you're saying through the implied volatility calculation or using the past history. But this is just a general terminology that going forward in time, the volatility is going to be this way. Okay. Now the ways of estimating historical volatilities. Okay. If the volatility is constant or varying very slowly, then what we could do, we could just take n days previous data. We know the returns on the n days. The definition of the variance itself is like returns of the n days squared, okay, divided by 1 by n. Okay. So that is how we basically evaluate the the variance of the volatility in case the things are not changing. Okay. But over here also there are some issues. The thing is, if all the returns are equally weighed, and then let us say that on one day for some reason the asset has got like very humongous returns, then obviously inside the calculation that asset is going to dominate, right? But that asset is just one day of dominance, doesn't say anything about a history or how the prices of the asset moves, because that thing might just be a random fluctuation that basically happened, which is not a signal of how this particular asset was actually varying over the period of time that you have. But that is obviously going to contribute even more, right? So because of that, what you would be having once you're having a very large number, when you basically evaluate the volatilities, right? Okay. Over various when you evaluate the volatilities, you will basically be seeing a plateau. Okay, because what you do is at one particular time you utilize everything that happened n time intervals before. in that n times n intervals before, at one particular time you had a very large spike. Okay, because you had a very large spike, that is going to contribute everything. Okay, so you will get one particular value depend on a particular large spike. So anytime in the next time interval also, if I calculate only, that is basically going to contribute the most. So because of that, I'll be getting like a plateau of volatilities until I get out of this particular until that particular time period that is there, where the spike was very high. That particular return doesn't get involved in a volatility calculation. Okay, so the thing is, there's other way. In case we are having time varying volatilities, that is volatility that changes the function of time, what we could do is we could basically incorporate a mean reversion. So on a long term, in case we have an estimate of what a long term mean is, okay, what we could do is we could evaluate the volatility, okay, at a particular time interval n, okay, as a sum of all the returns that you had. Okay, the volatility at the end day that is there, you could just evaluate it like this: something which is a long term mean, okay, plus the contributions from n days in the past. Okay, so that is how you will be utilizing this. So whatever information you have from all the previous n days, you will be taking one part from there, okay, with a particular probability, and the rest of the probability, what you do is you just take it from the long term mean. Okay, that is very long time. If you have some kind of an estimate of the mean, that is how you basically capture it over here. Okay, so that is why you could basically take two different this, when you're considering time varying volatilities. And this kind of model is basically called the ARCH model. Okay, auto regressive conditional heteroscedasticity. Okay, sorry, I cannot pronounce it very well, but this is how you will be doing it. So like, say for the day 1 that is there, you'll just be having the return of day 1, you'll get sigma phi 1. Okay, and then this thing is an estimate of a long term mean that you have. This thing should have been squared here. Okay, day 2 that is there, you'll be considering the returns of 2 days in the past. Okay, use that information to get sigma squared. Day 3 that is there, use that information to get sigma cube, etc. So that is basically, what we had done over here was, this thing was basically considering an average of many this days, and we are saying that the sigma that is there is not the volatility that is there is not going to be changing over many n number of days. Okay, so this thing was like a mean answer of the volatility. So what you could do is like, okay, on an average, in case you have an estimate of the mean value, you take that into consideration also in the calculation, as well as how things are basically changing by the day. Okay, so if you're having n days, after n days you basically take an average of n of these days, and then you're considering the mean variation also, mean volatility also, and that is going to give you sigma n squared. Okay, but the thing is, why does, again over here, there is no need that whenever you're evaluating these, for example, when you evaluated over here, what you're doing is you're basically evaluating each return. Okay, you're weighing that equally. Okay, but what you could do is you could basically say that the further away, like say if you're evaluating the volatility at the time step n, okay, what you could say is that further away from the time step you are, okay, lesser you will be utilizing that particular return, because the return further away is basically obviously going to be of less value compared to the return today, because the return in the closer time frame is going to give you much more better information about the randomness compared to return like infinite time interval in the past, right? So because of that, you could basically take an exponential moving average where the returns that are there closest to you are getting with a higher weight, and further away you basically getting a lesser and lesser weight. You could just utilize a term like this, lambda, which is like a probability, which is basically a number which is smaller from in this particular interval. And then since you want to make the weighing such that it's a probabilistic weighing, the sum of everything that is there multiplying the return should be equal to 1. That's the reason you're having a 1 minus lambda here. Okay, so 1 minus lambda ensures that the weights add up to 1. Okay, so if you take this particular expression that we have here, okay, and then afterwards say you evaluated you can use this to basically get this expression. Okay, so what it tells you is that the volatility today is equal to lambda times the volatility measured yesterday. Okay, volatility measured till yesterday. Okay, plus 1 minus lambda times the returns value, okay, that you had on the today. Okay, so what it basically says is that this particular way, exponentially moving average way of measuring velocity volatilities, is going to just utilize the recent estimate of the volatility and the return, okay, to evaluate the volatility today. Okay, so this thing is called a risk matrix volatility measure. Okay, now there is another thing. We could basically take what we had above. We could basically take arch that we had here. Okay, we are considering a long-term mean plus addition of to the volatilities of the returns a few in the past, okay, of a particular time point. Okay, you can combine that with an exponential moving average mechanism that you have, and then you would be getting something which is this kind of a form, and then you would get something which is called a Garch model. It's a generalized autoregressive conditional heterodicity. Okay, where this thing is sigma squared. Sigma n squared is something which is you're taking the long-term mean, okay, with a particular weight, and the rest of the weight you're like using the you're basically using you're using this particular information of the which was expected from the exponential moving average. Okay, now we can consider things such as the expected values of the future volatilities. Okay, let us consider it for the exponential moving average first. Since for the exponential moving average we know that sigma n squared is this formula, dependent upon the what you had in the past and the returns today. Okay, the you dependent on the volatility for yesterday and the returns today. Okay, if you take the expectation values on both the sides, there will be an expectation value here and expectation value here. The expectation value of Rn squared, okay, will basically just be the expected value of the sigma n that you have measured to at a particular point. Okay, so this is the definition, right? The expected value of the returns, okay, return squared, is basically a definition of the expected value of the sigma n squared. Okay, you take that, you plug it in over here, what you get is that the expected variance is basically the same as today. Expected variance in the future is the same as the expected variance today. This is the expression that you get for the expected future value volatility in EMVA. Okay, expected moving average volatility using exponential moving averages. Okay, if you want to evaluate the expected future volatility for GARCH processes, you can do the same thing. Take the expectations on both the sides. This thing is just going to be a constant. There is an expectation here, plus when you take the expectation of Rn squared, as we have said, it's just the exponential of sigma n squared. It's just the volatility at n squared, volatility at time n. Okay, and that's why we get an expression between we get an expression between the volatility today, and which is dependent on the expected value of the volatility today, which is dependent on the volatility yesterday, but it's not equal to the volatility expected value of the volatility yesterday. Okay, next we will consider another topic, which is the maximum likelihood estimation. These estimations are basically there that once you have been given a set of data points for a particular model, how do you evaluate the parameters of the model? One of the ways is the maximum likelihood estimation, and the maximum likelihood estimation says that what is the parameter choice that is there, what is the actual parameter value in the model which will have the highest probability of producing the particular observations of the variable. Say for example, hypothetically we had the stock prices following the normal distribution. Okay, so let us say the stock prices that were there, they're basically following this distribution given by the following equation. Okay, this thing is very hypothetical. Obviously the stock prices are never going to go this way, but let us say that under very rare circumstances might even go in such a direction. Okay, but let us say that the stock prices are going this way. Okay, obviously stock prices cannot go negative, right? But just for let us say that there is some kind of some weird kind of this either call it stock or something else which can give positive and negative with equal probabilities. and it follows a normal distribution. Now say that they were like in, and for n days you basically had these realizations of the stock prices. So the question is, what is the probability sigma such that the above realization had the highest probability of occurrence? So the probability of occurrence of these stock prices, because each of the occurrences is independent of each other, is just a multiplication of all of these, right? So the probability of occurrence of all of this is just multiplication of all of this. This is just going to be this thing raised to n times exponential of summation over these divided by 2 sigma squared. Okay. So then the way we would be evaluating the sigma is just take the what we are trying to evaluate is the sigma which will give the highest, which will say that which would basically say that the probability of realization of these n prices was the maximum. Okay. Then what we do is we take a derivative of this with respect to sigma, that is going to be equal to 0. When we solve for this is the answer we get. Okay. So this thing was just one particular example. What you do is you in maximum likelihood estimation of things, what you do is you consider you basically consider particular realization of variables given by probability distribution, and then you say that what are the parameters in the probability distribution which would basically give you the maximum probability of realization of this particular variables that you have. Okay, this is what we have done for a Gaussian distribution. You could do it for any possible distribution that you have.